Welcome to It's Your Ego, Stupid, a show lovingly intended for millions of spiritual, intelligent, and imperfect people like you who may at times be led into ego stupidity, a lesser version of yourself and a lesser version of life. This show will give you a much deeper understanding of what ego is, what it's doing to your life, how it can weaken your human and spiritual wellness, and how you can heal in each of these areas if needed. It's Your Ego, Stupid will heighten your awareness of the intense link between your ego and spirit, your humanity and divinity, and the synergy that can lead to the best version of you and your life. Your host is Dr. Nick Martin, a licensed psychologist who has worked in the clinical, university, school, and private practice settings over the past 40 years, while serving as a therapist, diagnostician, educator, and consultant. Welcome again to It's Your Ego, Stupid. And now your host, Dr. Nick Martin.
Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Nick Martin, and thank you for listening to It's Your Ego, Stupid. This is a program lovingly intended for spiritual, intelligent, and imperfect people, just like you and me, who may at times be led by our ego into something I call ego stupidity, a lesser version of ourselves, and often a lesser version of life. Ego stupidity can be affecting the relationship we have with our husband, wife, or partner, perhaps with our son or daughter, maybe our brother or sister, and even with ourselves. Ego stupidity that can make it difficult for us to achieve, to climb the ladder of success, to make use of all of our potential, and to experience a sense of purpose and meaning to our life. Ego stupidity that can make it difficult to deal effectively with all of the inevitable changes, adversity, stressors, or conflicts that happen in all of our lives. And finally, ego stupidity that's making it difficult to feel genuine, lasting happiness and can often lead us into unneeded or inappropriate anxiety, anger, guilt, sadness, or something I call fake happiness, which is pleasure-based happiness often masquerading for the real thing. If things aren't going well, or perhaps as well as you would like, you've come to the right place, because a lot of what's going wrong in our lives, or perhaps not as well as we would like it to go, has much to do with our ego energy, which is serving as the fuel for ego stupidity. It's often the unseen and unrecognized source of what's going wrong in our life, both humanly and spiritually. These are lessons I've learned from thousands of people, just like you, over the past 40 years. You've taught me with your lives, your relationships, and your experiences. What theorists, books, or schools of psychology could not teach me about ego. You've been my teachers. Again, I want to thank you for joining me for today's program, which will have us looking at healing our ego energy with ego medicine. Ego energy and ego medicine, I believe those are probably two relatively new ideas that maybe you've never heard about. Ego medicine is an approach that I developed and which I discussed in my books, Your Ego Stupid and Ego Therapy. I developed it because I learned from you that if we don't work on seeing the ego energy at work in our lives, little will change in the unhealthy thoughts and feelings and behaviors that are often unknowingly dominating our lives in so many important areas, while weakening us humanly and spiritually. Ego medicine is the main strategy I'm putting forth for healing one's ego energy when that needs to happen. It's a self-help approach to working on one's ego energy by you in order to heal it where needed. And that is whether it's a problem involving your ego power or perhaps your ego flexibility or your ego vulnerability. Maybe it's two of them or perhaps all three. With ego medicine, you don't have to go anywhere. You don't have to meet anybody. And you don't have to adhere to any time schedule. You're working with yourself, which makes it very flexible. And the monetary cost is minimal because you are working with yourself while using information from my books, my website, and this program. By now, you're probably wondering, what does ego medicine involve? What is it? Well, there are three main contributors to ego medicine that I'm going to be talking about throughout today's program. They are knowing what ego is and knowing what it isn't. That's the first main contributor, knowing what it is and knowing what it isn't. Unfortunately, when I've looked at writings on the internet and books and other resources involving the discussion of ego, there are a lot of things that are said about ego that I don't find to be true because of my experiences in working with people and having been exposed to them and their egos over time, over the past 40 years. So there's a lot of what I would say is misinformation, or what I'll talk about later are myths about what ego is. So having an understanding of what ego is extremely important, getting to the truth about what ego is, but also having an understanding of what it's not, getting at what ego is not. And again, there have been lots of things said about ego, which I have not experienced in my working with people and their egos. And again, I'm going to be explaining more of that as we go along. So that would be the first main contributor to ego medicine, having an understanding or knowing what ego is and knowing what it isn't. The second contributor to ego medicine is tuning into your ego energy. Tuning into your ego energy. Ego energy involves a diverse range of contributors that I'll be talking about today. And your ego energy is not necessarily the same as your brother or sister, your mom or dad, or mine. Our ego energy is very distinctive. And that means we have to work on getting to know it, to get a better understanding of it. So what we'll be tuning into, or working on tuning into, is how much ego power do you or I have, or does somebody have? In this case, you. How much ego power? And also tuning into how much ego flexibility are you experiencing within your ego energy? And also how much ego vulnerability are you experiencing within your ego energy? So that is the second contributor, main contributor to getting to involving ego medicine. And then the third one is to work on replacing ego-rooted, non-reality-based thoughts, beliefs, attitudes, prejudices, and illusions that many people carry around with them unknowingly, replacing them with reality-based and truth-connected, rational, logical, and accurate thinking in your life, particularly in those 10 important life areas, things like dealing with loving yourself healthily, and being able to form close relationships with loved ones, and being able to achieve with your potential, and all of the rest that I've been talking about through my previous programs. These are things that we can sometimes make use of non-reality-based thoughts and feelings and behaviors that are rooted in the ego energy that we are living. And these are the kind of things that often we can think in, even though we are intelligent beings. So it's not a problem with intelligence that leads us into these unhealthy, non-reality based ways of looking at things and understanding things. So that's the third contributor to our working with ego medicine. Again, knowing what ego is and what it isn't, coming to tune into your own ego energy, and working on replacing ego-related, non-reality-based thoughts, those which are more reality-based. So now we're going to get into each of them in more detail. And first we'll start by looking at the first of the three contributors to healing your ego energy, and that is having a solid foundation for understanding what ego is and what ego isn't. As I said in my very first program, ego is an energy. And its main purpose is to protect us, to keep us safe, and to promote our daily and human survival. Ego is an energy. Ask yourself, where have you heard that before? if you've heard that at all. I haven't seen it written about in any of the writings I've looked at, particularly in the level of detail that I talk about it in and will be discussing with you today. So that our ego is an energy, and this energy has a very positive purpose in our lives. Not an ultimately negative one, but a very positive purpose, which is promoting our survival. The same way your brain has a purpose in promoting your life and all the experiences you can partake in with it, or your heart is operating to keep you alive through pumping blood through your system. It's the same thing with your ego. Your ego has an ultimately positive purpose. It's an energy intended to promote your survival. And this notion that ego is an energy is the foundation on which I think you have to stand in order to heal your ego, to make use of ego medicine, to understand that you're working with energy. In this case, your own energy, your survival energy. Now, related to that, you must also understand that our ego is a diverse energy. That means that it consists of power and consists of flexibility, and it consists of vulnerability, that it's diverse. And that's a really important thing for you to work with, and I'll be talking a lot about that today and throughout all of my programs because, as I said earlier, this energy is different for different people. So we cannot take a one-size-fits-all approach to talking about ego energy or anybody's particular ego energy, because that'll leave us at a distance from what is really the case. So this ego energy, though, can at times negatively impact us in different ways, both humanly and spiritually. So it can affect us in our human life, in those important life areas, as I've said previously, as well as dealing with things like achievement and dealing with change and stressors and so on. And as I said in my last two programs, it can have a spiritual impact upon us. It can have a negative spiritual impact, meaning that it can distance us from our spirituality. It can undermine our spiritual wellness. But this has to do with ego energy being diverse. Now, in addition to understanding what ego is, which is an energy and that it's a diverse energy, we also must come to understand what it isn't. We must work on learning what some of those myths are, or the half-truths that people often have about ego, because they often serve as a poor foundation for understanding our ego, or ego in general, that is, and as well as our own ego in particular. They often perpetuate these myths, a lack of understanding of what ego is, and ultimately we're lost when it comes to working with and understanding ego. So we need to make ourselves familiar with those myths. And I'm going to talk about 5 of these significant or important myths or half-truths right now. I also refer to them in my book, so if you want to, you can take a look at them there. But the very first myth is that your ego has an intellect, and that it has an awareness of what it's doing in your life, which it doesn't, because it's an energy, and only that. I have seen references to ego talking about it as though an ego can think. Well, your ego cannot think. It is not able to cultivate or form a belief or an attitude or a value or anything like that. It's just an energy. It doesn't form thoughts or feelings or behaviors. That's what you do. And you do that based upon the nature of the energy that's flowing into your mind. And what's happening with that energy, whether it's a power thing or a flexibility thing or a vulnerability thing, that could be affecting the way we think, and then ultimately what we feel, and ultimately what we do. So your ego does not think. It doesn't have an intellect. And it will be important to discard that myth if that's something you tend to think ego is able to do. It doesn't do that. Another myth, a second one, is that your ego is intentionally impacting your life in often negative ways or destructive ways, which isn't true. that your ego is intentionally impacting your life, again, in negative ways, in harmful ways, or destructive ways, that it's doing it with intention. It's not true, because it doesn't have an intellect, as I said, involving the previous myth, upon which to form these harmful or destructive intentions for you or others. It doesn't do any of that any more than the brain or the heart could be said to intentionally malfunction to harm you or your life. It's not going to do that. It's not about doing that. It's not trying to hurt you. And in fact, your ego is actually trying to help you to cope in your life. But when it's unhealthy energy, it can often lead us into forming unhealthy thoughts and feelings and behaviors which it has no awareness of. Also, your ego is not trying to intentionally edge God out of your life, partly because it doesn't have an intellect to form an awareness of God. It doesn't know who God is. It doesn't have an intellect to know who God is or what God is, and in order to intentionally try to remove God from our life. As I've said, it can affect your spiritual wellness in my previous shows, but it's not doing any of that intentionally. It can create distance with which we form the ideas that cause us to lose contact with the love, the life, and the energy God is within our being. And it can lead us to think things that lead us to distance ourselves from the four great gifts I talked about. The gift of our life, the gift of being able to create our life, the gift of our eternal life, and the gift of God within. We are coming up on our first break. When we return, we're going to continue to talk about some of the myths that we must become aware of in order to develop a healthier understanding of what ego is and what it isn't. You're listening to It's Your Ego Stupid. This is Dr. Nick, and I'll see you after the break.
Conscious media for conscious minds. OMTimes. Being a radio host on IOM FM allows you to build your show on a rich platform with the power of the internet to fulfill your outreach goals and connect with a very specialized and global online audience, unlimited by time and distance. OMTimes Radio will provide you with web relevance, a recognizable conscious brand, and with the standard of excellence that has accompanied every single OMTimes endeavor. Host your show with OMTimes Radio Network.
Did you know that you have the power to change anything in your life? Did you know you can do so even with the things that you've already decided are impossible to change? Come join me, Venus Castleberg, on Outside the Impossible as I interview people from around the globe that have literally changed the things they thought were impossible to change just by using the amazing tools of Access Consciousness. Now airing Wednesdays 4 p.m. Eastern, 1 p.m. Pacific. Do you dare to believe that anything really is possible?
Hi, Dr. Nick Martin here. I want to invite you to visit my website, egoandspirit.info, where you can find lots of information on ego and download your free ebook copy of It's Your Ego Stupid. Fix it to fix your life. Also, please visit the shop page where you can find each of my other books, Ego Therapy, Ego Spiritualism, and The Two Voices Within.
A social distancing tip.
Putting distance between yourself and others is critical to slowing the spread of coronavirus. So here are ways to stay in contact without the physical contact part. Call, send a text, set up a video conference, post on social media, dedicate a song on the radio. If you have symptoms of fever, dry cough, and shortness of breath, call your healthcare provider before going to their office. For more info, visit coronavirus.gov.
Let's all do our part, because we're all #AloneTogether. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
Welcome back. You're listening to It's Your Ego Stupid, a program for intelligent, spiritual, and imperfect people just like you and me. Before the first break, we were talking about ego medicine, and we were talking about the three components of it. This is the main strategy I am recommending that we use to work with our ego energy and to heal it where needed. We were talking about the first main contributor, which is to understand what ego is and what it isn't. We mentioned that our ego is an energy, and that it is a diverse energy that comprised of power, flexibility, and vulnerability. We also were talking about the myths or half-truths that often are out there about what ego is, and which aren't really true. And we mentioned that your ego does not think, it doesn't have an intellect. Also, it doesn't have an intentional quality, means it's not intentionally attempting to hurt you or harm your life, even though that can happen as a result of imbalanced ego energy. We're going to continue by talking about three more myths, the third one being that your ego can only be negative and can only do harmful things to your life. Well, that myth is, I think, partially true. I would call it a half-truth, to the extent that your ego can lead us, or our ego energy can lead us towards suffering and lots of ego stupidity when it's unhealthy and it's imbalanced. I absolutely agree with that. We can start to experience lots of difficulties in our life as a result of this energy when it's unhealthy and imbalanced. So it can affect our ability to love ourselves. It can affect our ability to experience genuine happiness, our ability to work with changes going on in our lives and create issues and difficulties and all that kind of stuff that makes life challenging and quite difficult and often leads us into ego stupidity. But this idea of it being harmful, only harmful and negative, is not all the way true, because when our ego energy is healthy, when it's in a balanced place, it actually can serve us in some very positive ways, because it often will then be operating in the background of our life, not in the foreground. When it's unhealthy and it's imbalanced, yeah, our ego is in the foreground. It's really doing a lot of thinking for us, or not. It's leading us to the kind of thinking that's not healthy. It's not thinking for us. That's not what it does. But that energy that we're drawing upon can lead us to create the unhealthy thoughts and feelings and behaviors that we bring into aspects of our life that deal with relationships and with work and achievement and dealing with adversity and so on. But when our ego energy is healthy, it actually is working more so in the background. It's only coming to the foreground when we need it. We are in the foreground when our ego energy is healthy, and our spirit is in the foreground. So we can use our voice in our life, and we can listen to the voice of spirit come to us in our life when our ego energy is in the background. Again, only coming forth when it's needed to help us with the process of making sure that we are able to survive in our life. So that's the third myth that I wanted to mention to you. The fourth myth is that your ego can only operate in the past or the future, but not in the present. Again, your ego is an energy, or it's an entity actually that's often referred to as chaining us to our past, connecting us deeply into our past and preventing us from living in the present, or having us become overly preoccupied with the future. Well, that is true when our ego energy is unhealthy and when it's imbalanced, whether it's a power issue that we might have, or whether it's a flexibility related thing about the way we think about things going on in our past or how they might happen in our future, or the vulnerability related thing that we might be experiencing that leads us to feel more vulnerable than we may need to feel about things that were from our past, or perhaps things that we may face in our future. But when our ego energy is healthy, when it's able to be in balance, it actually can operate in the present. It can be in the here and it can be in the now. And it can assist us in meeting the challenges of today. And it can also help us with planning effectively for those of tomorrow and the future. So your ego energy is able, when it's healthy and it's in balance with regard to its power, its flexibility, its vulnerability, it can be a very healthy and powerful resource from which we can draw upon in dealing effectively with the future. So that's a fourth myth that I wanted to dispel. And the last one that I want to mention is that your ego must be dissolved, disowned, or defeated, which is not true. Your ego doesn't need to be dissolved. A lot of times I'm seeing people write about ego and they talk about the need to, some have said, kill the ego, or to somehow in some way, shape, or form cut it off as being a part of who we are in our life. As if we could do that in 5 minutes if we really wanted to. And that isn't any more true than we can disown our heart or our brain and still be a functioning human being. We need this thing called ego. We need it to be healthy. So the myth, it's a myth because we cannot do any of those things. We cannot remove ego from our being. We can't dissolve it. We can't disown it. We can't defeat it because it's an energy, as I've been saying on several occasions in this show. It's an energy, and it can't be removed. We can't be destroyed. It can't be disowned. It's part of what evolution has built into our being over millions of years. As I said previously, you may have been conceived of by your parents, but the design for your existence, brought forth through evolution, is millions of years old. And it's a design that included, just like it included your heart and your brain and your eyes and your ears and your hands and your feet, it also involved your ego. It is meant to be a part of you. What we need to do is understand how to heal it when necessary. The same way we go about healing our heart when that needs to be healed, or our brain when that needs to be healed, or any other aspects or parts of our body. We don't remove them. We don't throw them away because they're not working as well as we want them to. We work with them. We work to heal them. So this is what ego medicine is about, trying to work toward healing our ego energy where it's needed. So as I move toward the end of talking about these myths, I think it's important to remove each of them, these faulty notions, because they aren't going to help with the process of healing our ego energy. So that you can get to more of the truth about ego. When we remove these myths, we can get closer and closer and closer to the notions about truth about ego and your ego energy. And this is really an important beginning point for the healing of one's ego energy, where that's needed within its power, flexibility, or vulnerability. Because getting closer to knowing the truth about this energy with ego medicine will help to bring it to a more balanced place. It cannot do that for itself. That is something we must do. The same way if we have to heal another part of who we are, we have to understand it. We have to work with it in order to heal it. So I want to end the focus on this first contributor to ego medicine by saying that, again, we were designed by millions of years of evolution to heal humanly and spiritually when we make contact with the truth. In this case, we're talking about the truth regarding ego, the truth about our particular ego energy, and the truth in regard to how we can go about healing it. Okay, next we're going to start to talk about the second main contributor to ego medicine that leads to ego healing, having to do with tuning into your ego energy. Tuning into your ego energy, which means getting to know the amount or the volume of the power, the flexibility, and the vulnerability in your ego energy. We all have each of those three contributors or components to our ego energy, but there are differences in the amount of each of them, in the amount of the power, the flexibility, and the vulnerability of that energy. And you may recall a few shows back, I talked about how life, in the form of various experiences, various events, various relationships, has something to do with the nature our particular ego power, our particular ego flexibility, and our particular ego vulnerability. So we have to get to know us. We have to get to know our particular ego energy. And so that involves what I call tuning into our ego levels of volume in the power, flexibility, and vulnerability areas. Now, in order to do that, because I'm saying this on a broader level, but in order to do that, what we're going to do in order to do that, to tune in is, with my guidance, we're going to look into each of the important life mirrors. You may recall I've been talking about how we can use these important areas of our life, the chapters to our life story, whether it's dealing with forming close relationships or loving ourselves or being able to interact healthily with people or achievement, change, stressors, experiencing happiness. These are those mirrors I'm talking about. And we have to look into them to see more of what's going on and what's happening and what they are suggesting about the nature of our ego energy. So this involves taking a look at the kinds of thoughts and the kinds of feelings and the kinds of behaviors that accompany ego power, ego flexibility, and ego vulnerability. I want to mention that my book, Ego Therapy, is 656 pages long. A pretty long book. Why? Because it's speaking to the diverse nature of the energy and also the diverse nature of the kinds of thoughts and feelings and behaviors that people experience in conjunction with each of those components of our ego energy. So necessarily so in order to get into a more precise understanding, because I said earlier, a one-size-all-fits approach to talking about ego, to thinking about ego, to understanding of ego isn't going to cut it. And it hasn't cut it up to this point in time. This work, this involvement of tuning into your ego energy, will involve learning more about the amount of ego power and the amount of ego flexibility and the amount of ego vulnerability that's contributing to your ego energy. Again, something I refer to as volume. And this work is going to involve learning more about what needs to be changed and healed in your ego energy. As you do that, as you get to know where is that volume at, how am I doing with the power stuff, how am I dealing with the ego flexibility, how am I dealing with ego vulnerability, is going to give you some direction as to what maybe needs to be healed with your ego energy. Now, in an effort to do that, I'm going to talk about a scale, called an ego volume scale. And this scale is similar to other scales where people rate things on a scale of 0 to 10. You know, whether it's how well you liked a movie or how much you liked a certain food. Well, this scale has to do with how much ego flexibility or ego vulnerability or ego power is that you're operating with. So this is part of that tuning into. And as I said, this is a scale that runs from 0 to 10. At the very bottom or the low end of the scale are people who may be experiencing low ego flexibility or low ego power and low ego vulnerability. And if we go all the way to the upper end of the scale, we're looking at people who are at the top end, the high end, who may have a high amount of ego power or a high amount of ego flexibility or a high amount of ego vulnerability. So that's the area we're getting into to tuning in. We're using this scale. And I'm going to give you lots of examples to help you work with to start to work on tuning into your ego energy. So we're going to start talking about the lower end of that scale. People who would rate themselves as a 0 or a 1, involving any of those contributors to your ego energy. So let's say people with ego power, that's at a low end, at the 0 or 1 level. These are often people who are feeling very disempowered in important areas of their life. Let's say they're dealing with a relationship and they feel very weak in the relationship. They feel very disempowered. They don't have a lot of say in the relationship. They don't have a lot of influence or control. They have to do a lot of listening. Or let's say they're dealing with change. And these are the people who sort of passively deal with the changes going on in their life, whether it involves changes involving their development, or maybe there are technological changes going on around them, or work-related changes. But people have a difficult time dealing with feeling empowered who are at this place. And in my book, The Two Voices, The Two Voices Within, I talk about roles that people start to fall into who are getting at this level of ego energy, low ego power. People who may become the victim, or people who may be the martyr. Some who may be the underachiever, or the depressive, or the conformist. Each one of them dealing with issues involving disempowerment in their ego energy, which in some respects is entrapping them inside these particular roles that they are living out. So that's the case when we have low ego power, and the sense of disempowerment is manifested within different life areas, as well as into certain kinds of roles that people start to fall into. We're going to continue talking about low ego power, talking about low ego flexibility and low ego vulnerability after the break. And we're going to talk more about this scale as it applies to both the power area as well as the flexibility and the vulnerability area. You're listening to It's Your Ego Stupid. This is Dr. Nick, and I'll see you after the break.
The Real Conscious Connection. OMTimes Radio. IOM FM.
OMTimes magazine is one of the leading online content providers of positivity, wellness, and personal empowerment. A philanthropic organization, their net proceeds are funneled to support worldwide charity initiatives via Humanity Healing International. Through their commitment to creating community and providing conscious content, they aspire to uplift humanity on a global scale. Connect at omtimes.com. OMTimes, creating a more conscious lifestyle.
My name is Victor Furman. Some call me The Voice. I've always been fascinated with human nature, spirituality, science, and the crossroads at which they meet. Join me Wednesdays at 8 p.m. Eastern on OMTimes Radio, and we'll explore these topics and so much more on Destination Unlimited.
Hi, Dr. Nick here. I want to invite you to visit my website, egoandspirit.info, where you can find lots of information on ego and download your free ebook copy of It's Your Ego Stupid. Fix it to fix your life. Also, please visit the shop page, where you can find focused ego meditations that can help you know whether you are truly speaking with your voice in your life or ego is speaking for you.
Melissa from Michigan. I work an extra part-time job serving lunch at my child's school, but I still can't afford to put food on our table.
Daniel from California. Choosing whether to pay the rent or pay to fix the car to get to work doesn't leave us with much at all. Now we can't even pay for meals.
Hunger is a story we can end. End it at feedingamerica.org. Brought to you by Feeding America and the Ad Council.
Welcome back. You're listening to It's Your Ego Stupid, a program for intelligent, spiritual, and imperfect people, just like you and me. Before the break, we were talking about the second main contributor to ego medicine, which is tuning into your ego energy. And we were talking about what I call volume scale, which is actually rating yourself on the amount of ego power, ego flexibility, and ego vulnerability. And we go about doing that by taking a look at where we're at with regard to how things are going in the important key life areas. And we left off talking about ego power and low ego power, people who may rate themselves a 0 or a 1, who are feeling very disempowered in important areas of their life. And we're going to continue now talking about low ego flexibility, people who might rate themselves as a 0 or a 1. Again, this is about working on trying to tune in to see just where we are with regard to each of these contributors to our ego energy. So when people have low ego flexibility, amongst other things, these are people who are rigidly connected to only their own truth when they're dealing with important areas of their life, meaning that they tend to think in terms of their own way of looking at things, and they lock on very heavily to what they think, what they believe, what their attitudes, their values, their prejudices, their illusions. They have a very, very difficult time questioning their thoughts in those kind of areas. They're locked in. They're very stuck on what they believe. And they often feel they own the truth, a truth that they need other people to come around to recognize and maybe even be converted to. And again, they imply this kind of rigidity. Whether they're dealing with change, they may try to force change into something they already know or understand or they want to know. They are, they're not able to think out of the box very well. They kind of get stuck, just in terms of what they want to, and sometimes they're just going what they want to know and what they want to think, even though there may be a better idea that's there. But this is part of the ego energy that they are dealing with various parts of life. When it comes to maybe failures or losses or mistakes, they can be the kind of person that wants to solve the problem in the same way, even though it may be not the same problem, or they haven't been successful doing it that way. They stay stuck on doing these things. And this doesn't mean they're stupid. It doesn't mean they're not intelligent. They can be a very intelligent person, and they can be a very spiritual person. And they are not mentally ill. They're just stuck in the way they look at things and they understand things. In my book, The Two Voices Within, I talk about the roles that people start to live. The authoritarian person. Many of us may have had what were authoritarian parents who, it's my way or the highway kind of parenting, very cold kind of parenting, a parent who wasn't very good at listening to what we had to say, and people who are racists, they are also people who are living in the role of low ego flexibility. They are stuck on their ideas and their beliefs about how people are and how or who they are, and they often take a very negative view on people who may from a different racial background. Or same way with people who are sexists. They are also living in the role. People who live in the role of a sexist may have very antiquated ideas or beliefs or understandings about members of the opposite sex. Sometimes there are people who are religious extremists who tend to think a certain dogmatic way about how things are, in the way we should know God, the right way to know God and the wrong way to know God, and they're locked into how that should be. So these people are living in a very rigid kind of way of looking at things and thinking about things and aren't interested in hearing anything different. So that's a reflection of the kind of energy, low ego flexibility energy, that can be taking place for somebody with low ego flexibility. They're somewhere in between those two areas. When people have low normal ego power, there's a need for some fine tuning in their ego functioning with the use of ego medicine, so they often may need some improvement in their sense of empowerment or their ability to seek out truth beyond themselves or within their ability to recognize their weaknesses and imperfections. They're not having as much difficulty, but they're not completely where they need to be in terms of being able to do any of those things. And there are a lot of people who are experiencing what I would call low normal ego power, low normal ego flexibility, or low normal ego vulnerability. Now we're going to move toward the middle of the scale, the place where people may want to be, the healthy place, having to do with balanced ego power, balanced ego flexibility, and balanced ego vulnerability. This is obviously a healthy ego energy location. On the scale, these would be a person with a 4, 5, or 6 in the middle of the scale. And this is suggesting, again, that their ego energy is healthy and it's balanced, and it's not getting in the way of living the best version of you, humanly and spiritually. It means that you are healthily empowered and that you can share control with others in life. So if you're in a relationship, let's say it's with your husband, wife, or partner, you can share the control within the relationship. You can help make the decisions. Maybe you work with your partner to allow them, or to encourage them. I don't want to say allow, but you leave room for them. So whether you're communicating, or you're creating in the relationship, or you're showing compassion, or you're compromising, you are able to do all of those things pretty effectively. Another aspect, when your ego energy is healthy and it's in regard to its ego flexibility, you're more healthily connected to truth. You're willing to seek it out when you need to, for particularly truth you don't know yet or that you think you need to learn more about, but you're also willing to question the truth that you do know, the things that you think, and maybe there's something I need to look further at to make sure that, in fact, it's true, and to be able to remove the false truths that you may be carrying around with you, that maybe you're encountering and maybe dealing with change or adversity or dealing with stressors. There's a lot of things that we can get into that we need to know more truth about in order to work more effectively with it. And also with people who have healthy ego vulnerability, the 4, 5, or 6 people, that means you're healthily connected and you're accepting of your weaknesses and your imperfections. And these are the ones that we all have, that we're all experiencing. I should mention, by the way, that most people are not in the balanced location with regard to their ego energy, the power, flexibility, and vulnerability. But they may think they are, because most people want to see themselves a certain way rather than the way they truly are. There's sort of maybe a positive bias for many people. And you might ask, well, how would I know that? And I say the answer to that is by taking a deep, long look into what's really happening in those important life areas. See where you're at. And my books give references to how you would see things or do things or handle things, whether it's power, flexibility, or vulnerability related that's taking place. And I would say that most people do need some improvement within their power, flexibility, or vulnerability. Okay, moving along up toward the upper portions of the volume scale. Some people have what I would call high normal ego power, ego vulnerability, or ego flexibility. On the scale, they might be rating a 7 or 8. And this suggests the need for some fine-tuning in their ego energy and their ego functioning with the use of ego medicine. So people that may be having some difficulty sharing control with others when would be appropriate to do so, they tend to want to have more than their share of control. Or some people who may be leaning more on others than themselves when it comes to seeking truth, when seeking out truth. They're leaning too much on other people and not enough on themselves. That's getting toward high normal ego flexibility. And also when people are having difficulty accepting themselves as they are sensitive to what's going on. They are seeing weaknesses and imperfections in themselves. They're very sensitive to that. And I think there are a lot of people who are in this place. Got to move on now to the very last top end of the scale, dealing with high ego power, high ego flexibility, high ego vulnerability. These are the 9 or 10 people on the scale. For those with high ego power, they often feel overly empowered in important areas of life. Again, this is playing out in relationships. This is playing out in many areas. We're dealing with change. They have to run things. They have to control things. They have problems dealing with mistakes, failures, or losses. The roles I talk about in the 2 voices within include dictator, the narcissist, the rebel, the control freak, and the bully, amongst many others. Now, when it comes to high ego flexibility, these are persons who may feel a need to always look to others for the answers and to learn the truth, so they have a difficult time looking inside of themselves. These are people who may get into the role of cultist, or the adult child, or the loyalist, or the puppet. And finally, people with high ego vulnerability are people who have a great deal of difficulty with their human imperfection, their weaknesses, and their vulnerability. A lot of times the roles that they find themselves living include that of the perfectionist, the high maintenance partner, the stressed out person, or the overachiever. Each of these types of roles suggest a need to do some significant ego work with the use of ego medicine. Now, before I leave today, before I leave the focus on tuning into your ego energy, I want to offer some final thoughts about this contributor to ego medicine. It can take a long time, or it can take some time to tune into your ego energy, because we often see ourselves the way we want to see ourselves, or are used to seeing ourselves, rather than the way we truly are. But this can give way to a greater truth as you grow in your familiarity with ego. And you can see this energy at work in your life in much more precise ways than maybe you are. This is what I would call the magnification and the illumination of our ego and our ego energy. And this is the part of ego medicine where you're putting yourself and your ego energy under the microscope, so to speak. But you're not going to be doing this alone. Each of my books are intended to help you with this tuning into process, getting to know your ego volume level and helping you to know what's going on in your specific ego energy and where you need to heal. And there are lots of examples about thoughts and feelings and behaviors linked to both the balanced and the imbalanced ego energy locations along the continuum to help you with that tuning into process, as well as within each of my 4 books, as well as will occur across my programs. Next week, we're going to continue talking about ego medicine by looking specifically at our ability to replace ego-rooted, non-reality-based thoughts with those that are reality-based and truth-connected. So that'll finish up our look at ego medicine, which is the primary approach to going about healing our ego energy. We have reached the end of today's program. I hope that what I've shared with you about how to heal your ego energy will serve as a dose of ego medicine. Also, if what I've shared with you today resonates with you, would you please share it with others? I want to thank you for listening to today's program and allowing me to be your servant. I want you to have a great week, and please come back to my next program. In peace and love, this is Dr. Nick saying goodbye for now.